it's a pleasure for me to open the activities this evening, and I would like to introduce you to Simone Becker. She is going to conduct the activities tonight together with Marcos Hacilan, and she will welcome and present our keynote this evening. So just a second. Simone Becker is a PhD in education from Universidade Federal de Santa Maria with research in the field of technologies applied to education. She's currently pursuing a master's in teaching and learning in higher education at the University of Malmö in Sweden. Well, Simone, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you and with Natalie, our special guest. So before Natalie started her lecture, I'd like to tell a little bit about herself. So Natalie Deanmade works as a freelance educational gamification consultant and Moodle administrator. She is interested in researching emerging technologies and how gamification can transform traditional education. Natalie participates in the global communities of mobile learning, Moodle learning management systems, gamification designers, and technology innovation groups. We will have Natalie's speech during about 40 minutes, and then we will open for questions. So please write down your questions in the chat in English, so Natalie can answer them. So welcome, Natalie. We are delighted to have you here.
Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm happy to be speaking to you from Melbourne, Australia, although I've spent most of my time recently in Tanzania, so you'll see a lot of Zanzibar references in my LinkedIn profile and information about me. So I'm living in both Australia and Africa is really my life story. So today I get to talk to you about my favorite topic, gamification. And I see that I'm with my peers. I looked at your program and I'm really quite impressed with the number of experts and the experience that is in this room. So I look forward to making more friends and connecting and going on this journey together as educators. The topic I'm going to discuss is that fun is another word for learning. And I'll tell you where I got that quote from as I go through my slides. Can I just check, are you seeing presenter view or are you seeing my normal PowerPoint view at the moment?
Your normal PowerPoint.
It's everything.
Let me see if I can switch over. How's that? It's looking like presenter.
Perfect.
Okay, so generally I start with an exploration of the terms around games and play, and I can see that I'm in an audience where you've spent your years doing this, so I won't dwell on it very deeply. And I think this is where we all start, is to go back and revisit our own understanding of these terms. So could I challenge you to use your chat? Can you tell me the last time that you used the word play in a sentence? Was it today? Was it yesterday? Could you all just write in the chat? So you could write something like, my son went to play football. Because you're at a conference about play, perhaps his question will be different today. So I'll just give you a minute. I'd like everybody to write a sentence in the chat using the word play in a sentence. So generally when I ask this, I get a wide variety of answers, and it does cover all the different realms of play and games in our society. And it really makes us wonder how we use that word and how it changes over time when we're older and younger. And that's something that I'm sure most of you have looked at before. We really do start arguing with each other when we try to define what is a game and what is fun. So the title of my speech is based on a book by Raf Costa. If you haven't found him yet, he is the person who has inspired me most to understand my journey as an educator. And his definition of fun and games is from a game designer's point of view. And on the right of this slide, you will see that he tries to break games and fun down into 4 areas. And I'm wondering, of those 4 things that you can see on my slide, which of those game mechanics do you think are of most value to us as educators? I'm not sure mastering our physical reactions, like being on a roller coaster or sports even, would be useful to us as educators. Perhaps you disagree. But the one on the bottom right is the one that fascinated me. He talks about risk and chance. And I think this is the biggest difference between traditional standard education and the gamified approach that I take, is that I do try to increase the risk and increase the opportunity of winning and losing. And what I'm doing is I'm exploiting what he calls a brain software bug around probability estimation. That's a very interesting way of defining a core game mechanic. And we're going to explore how I've been able to use that in various education settings. I hope I can inspire you to just think outside of the box and see how we can exploit this brain software bug. So that's where I got the quote. But I'm saying that not just fun is just another word for learning. I'll say that gamification is also just another word for learning. In a typical learning journey, there will be points of hard work or boredom or challenge, and we create moments of fun as peaks. And that's one of the biggest criticisms that I face when I talk about gamification. People imagine that we're sitting at the fun level the whole time with balloons and clowns. But anybody who actually plays games realizes that you only get those moments of celebration after some fairly arduous work. You have to put in the effort, and then the rewards come. And that's something that I think this audience understands, so I don't have to delve into that. But it is that very frustrating misconception that we have when we try to approach business owners and managers with our ideas, that we're constantly having to explain this flow state and how it is achieved and how we can mimic that in our classroom. I watched a presentation online of Raf Costa, and it was at the GDC online conference. They recorded everything, and on the left you can see there's a transcript. So I would really encourage you to look that up and enjoy learning from a master. Another master I've learned from in the game industry, Jason Vandenberg, he realized that the sorts of games that he played were not the sorts of games that his daughter or his friends played. So he wanted to understand what is fun for somebody else. And as educators, that's our challenge. If we walk into a classroom, we know how we like to be assessed, we know how we like to learn, but what about the others? How do we step into their shoes and understand their motivation? So he came up with a rather interesting matrix of every game. He sat down and played every single game his company had ever made. And he came up with these 4 different areas of novelty, challenge, harmony, and stimulation. And then he went to the next point and asked what psychological frameworks back this up. And he started talking about Ocean or Big 5. And I was quite interested in that because I'd been following a different way of thinking using Bartle player types. And I'm going to go quite deep in this presentation because I feel I have an audience that's interested. And I'll show you how I took his framework and the most evidence-based scientific approach of understanding personality and motivation, and then Bartle player types, and how that has guided me as an educator. I've also looked at other research from different disciplines to back up what I'm doing. So this reference here is to a study that was done on twins, because you do wonder, if you had the same parents, if you had the same food, if you had the same school, if you had the same teacher, would you have the same reaction? And the answer is no. The middle section C shows that our shared environment has very little effect on how we perceive enjoyment. So there's a lot of evidence to back up this reason that we need to accept different motivations for individuals and work with those. So the next part of my session goes into why gamification is useful for educators. And another one of the criticisms that we get is, but does it apply in learning? Aren't games and play outside of learning? And I very much don't agree with that. So my definition of gamification is that it is a design process that uses game elements and game thinking to reframe a life task to be more appealing and more achievable. So those last two there words, appealing and achievable, really wrap up why I, as an educator, have chosen to do this. I want the end goal, whatever it is, to look appealing and also to feel achievable. So let me ask you if you would like to write in the chat again. And perhaps, I'm seeing I'm talking to a bunch of educators, I might ask you as parents instead. Have you ever done something to try to make something look more appealing and more achievable to get your children to do something? And is this gamification? Or as a teacher, if you'd like to share your experience as a teacher, could you just write something in the chat of what you've done? And I'll tell you something I've done this week. I've been in lockdown for nearly a year and I'm going insane. I'm living with two teenagers. We used to have house support when we lived in Tanzania, and now we don't. So my teenagers and I have to figure out how to run a house ourselves, and it's not going so well. So I started a WhatsApp group. I hope they don't wake up and hear me talking about them. I called it Sinners, and now you can take photos if somebody in the family leaves a plate or a cup out or breaks a family rule about eating something. And they are absolutely loving it. My children have become house tidy, and it's just working, and I'm shocked and surprised that something so simple as giving them a chance to report on each other has been very motivating. And now we've got to the point where we've got a certain amount of sins, and mummy gets put on the sinners group as well. We're going to decide how many points, who's the worst sinner in the family, and then we're going to have to come up with either a punishment or a reward. And now I'm at the next point thinking, should it be rewards based or should it be punishment? I'm yet to see. Perhaps you can give me some ideas how you think I should continue with my little WhatsApp experiment in motivating our family to be tidy. As my children have grown up, I've looked at what does motivate them without me being involved. What self-organized learning, what self-motivation. Minecraft and Loom bands just astounded me. They were quite young, pre-literate, and yet they managed to learn and they wanted to get better. And if you look in the bottom right corner, this person put up a video of how to make a rainbow loom, and look at the number of views these children are getting from other children. So surely there's something as educators we can learn about the motivation cycles that are happening in these spaces. So I tried to learn. I listened to my teenage students who were all serious gamers. I listened to all these gurus that I went online and taught myself. I actually majored in drama as a theatre studies in my arts degree. So it's pretty natural if you put a drama teacher in a classroom that things just might be a little bit different to what you expect. So I invented this scenario called the Velvet Throne, and it did work much, much better than I could even have possibly imagined. There's a website that you may be able, it's quite a few years old now, but the website's still available if you'd like to see how I set it up. Schools have often used house systems, so it wasn't anything new that I did, but I used a house system within a classroom rather than across the whole school. And I had cross matrices going on where you could belong to a guild as well as a house. And I asked the students to lead. So they could be a mentor in their chosen field, and then they would assess the others, and then they would tell the others what they had to do to earn a master badge. Little did I know, I actually reduced my workload immensely. And then they actually started reading the assessment criteria, because when they were doing it for themselves, they were not so interested. But when they were mentoring another person, they had the motivation to read the rules and then go and tell the new people what they had to do. Our government was going through some severe funding cuts at the moment, so I ended up with 3 levels of students in my one class. And it was amazing because I'd never had that before. And I realized that that was my ideal learning environment, to have diploma students in the same classroom as the entry-level students. And I wish all schools had that flexibility to design vertical classrooms and set up these peer-based approaches to encouraging others. The other thing that reduced my workload is I ran my own Moodle site, and I set up a lot of learning that was very self-paced. So even though I was there as a facilitator, my role changed, because I can't possibly take 3 levels of students through the same program. So I had to step back and watch what happened. I would put resources online. I would use the activity completion to see what had been done by different people. I could see each student where they were lagging, and I could appoint another student or myself to step in and make sure that they had read or done whatever needed to be completed. I experimented with some pretty fancy Moodle settings with groups, and it was, looking back, I think I must have had a lot of time on my hands to do all of this. I set up the grade book perfectly to map different levels and weeks. And then I decided to write it all in a book, which if you look on my website, you can download a step-by-step instruction of how I set this up and how Moodle became a tool to give me the a change in role as a teacher, to step back. And I constantly asked these teenagers, there was probably about 100 of them by the time I'd gone through this process over a few years, and they gave me really good guidance and insight into what I was doing and how it mapped with their virtual worlds that they live in, where they have a lot of autonomy. They manage their own servers, they manage their own rules. So they basically designed this classroom with me. And what we wanted was to see that what we were doing was not discouraging anybody. There were some people who were fairly neutral to what we were doing, but as you can see, it's probably very small, but most people said that they were very happy with what we were doing, and at least 3s, 4s, or 5s. And this was a college environment where a quarter of my students would be mature age people returning to education. And then most of them would be late teenagers, early 20s. So it was a bit of a risk to do some of the things that we did with older people in the room. But we found they were on board. They really decided to get in and enjoy it rather than resisting it. And at the end of every year, I'd ask them what we should do next year, what worked, what didn't. And they really did give me the feedback that this approach was extremely different to what they had experienced in school. They loved the freedom. They loved the individualization. They loved that they could choose what they wanted to do. And they did like that I wasted time in class playing. I'd bring in pizzas and drinks and have ceremonies with badges. And sometimes people say that a teacher shouldn't have that luxury of playing during school time. But we did, and we enjoyed it. So I went from standard completion rates of around less than 10% in Australia when you sign up for a college degree, and it went up to 63% of our class would finish. And after this point, it even went up higher again. So for me as a teacher, that was really good for me to track, because I've always been an interested, passionate teacher, but I still only got 10% completions, and it broke my heart. It's like, you walked in the door, you came, why did you leave? And they leave quietly. They wouldn't tell me why they leave. I just never see them again. So to put this type of process in place and get the tribe mentality that we had and the commitment was really rewarding. The other teachers who would have my students on different days gave me feedback as well. They said, your students are different. They are resilient, they're autonomous, and they're happy. Like, well, who would have thought that a velvet throne scenario would actually transform the way people learn? There were complaints as well. people were very resistant, especially the achiever types. They wanted to be told step by step, this is what you'll be doing on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, this is what you have to achieve. And they did really struggle with me not taking that leadership role, but eventually they came around and they did realize that, particularly we were studying digital media, that you can Google so much. There is so many tutorials out there. So I don't have to sit down and teach you Photoshop. You can Google it, you can ask your friend. And then if you say, well, why did I come to college if you're just telling me to Google it? It was hard to get their head around that mentality of what my role was as a teacher. And I'm sure that the managers above me would often get complaints about my methods, but I fortunately had support to go ahead with the way that I wanted to run the classroom. So now that I've told you what I've been able to achieve in that scenario, and there's been many, many since, if you'd like to talk to me in other forums about what, how else I've applied it, I wanted to explain the theory behind what I do. So I mentioned that I was a drama teacher. So I see my students as going through a learning journey or a transformation, which is not unlike a movie. So in the chat, can I ask you to type your favorite movie? And then ask yourself, is the character in your favorite movie undergoing a transformation? Do they change from the beginning to the end of the movie? What do they learn? How do they learn it? And you'll see that's how I understand learning, that everybody who walks into my classroom is going on a learning journey that involves their personal life as well as whatever learning objectives I've got in mind for them for their digital media certification. So what I'm aiming to do is to create dreads and desires, include the function of drama in the learning process. So there's a few references in my footnotes to this researcher Court from MIT, and he had a beautiful way of explaining that we often focus on the left of this diagram of data and Q&A, and we don't move up into the other side of wisdom and story, of really applying how that knowledge and that skill that we're teaching you is going to transform your life. The other person who inspired me was Dorna's PSI theory of emotions. So this theory says that we have fuel tanks. There's more than the three I'm showing you. There's our basic physical needs, but this is getting up to the next level where we have a need for affiliation, certainty, and competence, which is quite similar to SDT theory and many others out there. But this one also goes a bit deeper and says that the drips out of the bottom is how quickly you lose your fuel and how quickly you can replenish it. And each one of us is different as to how much we lose, how much we can absorb, and also our comfort point. When I'm driving my car, I have to fill up with petrol when it's on about just less than half. I'm quite conservative at this point in my life. When I was younger, I often let it get to nearly empty. Got myself caught out a few times and changed my behavior. So as people, when you're with other people, you get to the point where your tank is full. I've had enough interaction, and then that tank will deplete and you'll need to replenish your affiliation tank at some point. So I think we all understand that. But what about certainty and risk? Where's your comfort point for risk? When have you had too much? When do you feel scared? When do you feel out of your comfort zone in a good way or in a bad way? So I've really was fascinated with this way of thinking about people. And then how does it map to these Ocean 5, Big 5 types and also Bartle? So the next slide shows how those three tanks, affiliation, certainty, and competence, can be mapped to the typical Bartle player types. And this was research done by Monica Mayer. So what she's saying is that the explorer type is the ideal type. They're quite balanced. Their fuel tanks are comfortable. They know how to fill them up. They know how to deplete them. Whereas the achiever type is different. They really are not in the classroom looking for social reassurance or connections. They're looking to increase their competence fuel tank, and their ability to cope with risk and certainty is not very stable. And the socially dominant or the killer types, all three of their tanks are empty and fluctuating. And as a teacher, they're our hardest group to struggle with because we have to figure out why they're not engaged. So remember the other types I mentioned at the beginning with the novelty, challenge, and stimulation? If you start mapping all these things together, you get a really interesting picture of how people change over time. Because when you do walk into a new environment, you may start with a different motivation or a different type of behavior. And then as you become a confident learner, you will change. So how do we take people on this journey to become explorers, to become independent, autonomous? And what stops people? Why do people drop out? When you're dealing with very large classrooms, you can't get to know all your students. But what if we could divide them into 4 basic categories and make sure that our learning plans at least acknowledged these 4 basic motivations? So I don't know if you're all Game of Thrones fans. It's a pretty global phenomenon. Perhaps you know these people. I had fun putting them in corners. I'm not going to divide every person I ever meet into 1 of 4 characters, but it is the way that I think about students now. Which one of you falls into which category, and how do I balance you to work with each other to give you that stimulation and relationship that you need to create the tribe? And who's the ideal learner? I think it's Jon Snow. I think he's the explorer type. He's a bit curious and creative. He's friendly, supportive, playful, entertaining, organized and dedicated. We don't really have ideal students all the time. Quite often in the college sector I'm working in, you get extremes where on the outer edge of this, you get shallow learners who just try to tick all the boxes, or you get dominant, disruptive, sneaky, resistant people. The explorer types, if they go too far, they're bordering on genius, insanity, perhaps autism. So you've got spectrums and extremes of where students are sitting, and given the right support and opportunity, they can move back into the more productive edge of where they sit. So that's a lot of information. I do hope you can have a look at these slides and absorb all of that a lot more. It was something I thoroughly enjoyed researching, and that's how my mind thinks about classroom design now. So I wanted to show you a few other design tools that I have made myself or that I use. I published this a long time ago. It's available on my website, moojoo.com.au, for free, and it is in a few different languages. I think it's in Portuguese as well as Spanish. And I can't scroll right in it, and I decided not to spend too much time on this because I'm sure you'll be able to read it and you're a high level audience, so I didn't spend time. But each one of those colours indicates whether the Moodle activity, I'll say a quiz, how does a quiz appeal to different learners, or writing an assignment? What types of learners enjoy writing an assignment or a discussion forum, and how do we know which tool is right for this learning outcome? And then I'll take you to the next part of saying, well, perhaps it's about their learning journey. Perhaps a quiz is useful at the beginning, or is a quiz more useful at the end? How do we decide when a particular tool should be used for students? This is another poster that I made that's a very high level. It's like a business canvas, but it's gamification design canvas. So you want to think about your objectives as an educational institute or a teacher. Then you want to think about the learners, what their objectives are. Then you want to think about the behaviours that you want to see and the values. Like, is collaboration a value that you want to see in your classroom? How are you going to reward that and encourage that? Can you wrap a story around it? This is my favourite part. I'm quite creative. I come up with a theme like the Hobbits or the Game of Thrones, or all sorts of scenarios that give it some narrative and give it some tension and give it some resolution. Then you start thinking about the activity loops within each one of those lessons. How are you going to measure it? What rules are you going to have? What choices are you going to give people? So if you can fit all of this onto an A4 sheet, you've done well. And it's good for somebody like me to think at this very high level quickly before I go too deep and get lost in all of the details. And this is the book I mentioned before, where I explain step by step how I configured Moodle to work with gamification elements. It's a few years old now, but it's still relevant because I kept it at the highest possible level. So this is another planning tool that I use in workshops and training. If you're taking somebody on a learning journey from novice through to problem solver, then master, expert, visionary, you could think of it just as one row. So you'd think, where should I put the quiz? Should the problem solver get a quiz or the visionary? I would give it at the problem solver level because they're just wanting to test their knowledge and they're wanting some feedback. Am I on track with this? Am I getting this right? And then you could do it again at the expert level with a much deeper, harder quiz that really assesses whether they've reached it. Whereas at the visionary level, I'm not so sure that a quiz would be really useful to them. And each one of these rows actually gives me a chance to think, have I given these students an opportunity to collaborate and share? Not that every student wants that or needs that, but I'll design it in my plan so that the opportunity is there. And I would be making sure that even at the novice level, that I would put an activity in there. So in Moodle, if I was designing an online course, it would be a discussion forum. I'd make sure that the people didn't drop out because of a lack of having their affiliation tank renewed. Whereas the novices probably don't need challenge and accountability. I could just leave that square blank. But when it comes to the other layers, problem solver, master, yeah, definitely add some challenge and accountability. So that would be where I'd put an assignment or something where they get direct feedback and grading. And just to explain this more using Bartle's terminology, along with the hero's journey I'm talking about, you can imagine that this little character is sitting up the top there. This is his normal everyday life. He's just walking along that line, and for some reason, he gets thrown into a loop of changing his behavior and going through a process of transformation. So Bartle spoke of two different pathways. The inner pathway is more social than the outer pathway. And I'll come back and explain this in a bit more detail, that the hero's journey explains that you start in your normal everyday life and then you go around the clock into the abyss and then you're transformed and then you come back. So how this works for us as educators is that you're not aware that you lack a skill, then you become aware, then you actively work through skills and challenges, and then eventually it becomes a part of you and you don't have to think about it. It's a different part of your brain is involved in doing that action. So Bartle helped me understand that the inner track, the students may start off as disruptive griefers, and then they might become networkers, and then they become the leaders and the politicians in the class, and eventually they settle into a mode called friend. Whereas the more solo learners would start off as an opportunist, then they would move into a role of a scientist, and then a planner, and then a hacker. So this is his 8 player types, which was a second edition after the 4 that he started with. And I think there's a lot of people here who would love to go deeper into how Bartle, what he observed from multiplayer games years ago, and how he got this insight that there are predictable paths that people will go down as they become more embedded in this community of learners. So hopefully that explains to you what I call the hero's learning journey and how it relates to this typical hero's journey that we've all heard about before. So I'm kind of getting to the end. I wouldn't mind having a discussion and some chat with people, but I'll just leave you with a few thoughts as we wrap up. Another topic that's quite controversial is extrinsic and intrinsic, and I do feel that we expend a lot of energy on this topic, and it's not something that people often have ever done or understand. And once you start using these gamification techniques in a classroom, it is quite a different experience. So from my advice I'd like to share is, if you can find the intrinsic rewards that relate to the culture of the local community that you want to engage, and then build game-like interactions on top of those. So for my very young group of game designers that were mainly boys, their intrinsic reward was really quite different to a recent project where I was running pandemic preparedness training for senior people in 15 West African countries. What's their intrinsic reward that will work for them? And I've got photos on my phone that they loved badges. I put a little gold badge inside Moodle, and anybody who gave an evaluation got a secret badge, and then they started sharing it on their WhatsApp group. So maybe those two groups are not as different as we'd think. But I always really try to localize what I do. What does this group of people need, and how can I work with that? So as educators, we can ask ourselves, how do I offer diverse choices of activities and assessments that are outside of my own preference? How do I recognize when to change my role as a teacher as people go through their learning journeys, to be supportive or directive or just observing? What do they need from me at this point in time to stay engaged? Are my words and feedback creating this growth mindset that they can keep on learning? And are the learners building resilience? Because that's the goal. We want them to be able to accept their failures and keep on trying. And we want to avoid gamification being used as a shaming tool, as Class Dojo is often used to give penalty points. And it's a motivation technique that can actually disengage more people than it engages. So it's a double-edged sword. For me personally, what I've taken away from my journey as an educator is that if people are not finding patterns, it's not fun. So they need lots of challenges. And I think of learning as a spiral with all the ups and downs of emotion, and we don't want to break that momentum, because learning and play come naturally, and we often just get in the way of that natural cycle of curiosity. So us teachers or parents or coaches or priests and artists, everybody is about transformation and learning. And play is a way that helps all of us to explore the possibilities of change, and it helps us to address that power differential that you take as a teacher or a parent, and it can help the learners engage with you more by being more playful. And the final quote I'll give to Kevin Werback, who I learnt a lot from in a gamification MOOC, that the true reward is the journey. A gamification system that emphasizes progression, provides well-designed informational feedback, and surprises and delights can remain engaging for the long haul. That's a very worthy standard for us all to aim for. There's some of my research notes here, and I believe these slides were made available to you, so you can look back through some of those sources that I have enjoyed. I'm on Twitter occasionally, not so much, but you can send me a message there. That's my email address and my web address. So I will stop sharing now and go back to the chat. Now I'm going to find out if people actually chatted.
Thank you so much, Natalie.
You're welcome.
Would you like that I read some conversations?
Please
so we
do.
have here, Valdic Salles is saying, how to know if a certain game is an educational or not?
Well, Bartle, one of my heroes, said that if you play a pokie machine, it might be a game to you, but if somebody comes and cleans the pokie machine and does a mechanical test to see if it's working, it's not a game to them, because their interest in it was to see if it was functioning the way that they expected to. So the lesson for me is it's not the tool or it's not the game, it's your attitude to it and it's how you use it. So a teacher may say this is an educational game, and I can bet my son would laugh at you and say, no, it's not. There is no such thing as an educational game, because in his mind, it's not fun and it's not a game.
That's right. Oh, first of all, I would like to thank you for your reflections and your ideas. It was very inspiring. And I think many good ideas for teachers in Brazil would be well applied. So, as I said before, now we have some time for questions. And I would like to ask some questions for you first. And you said something very interesting. I think it was in the beginning about what is fun for an adult might be not so fun for a teenager, right? So, what do you think is the best way to know which games are interesting for students or not?
I would say at the teenage time of your life goal is to make friends. You're stepping outside of your family and you're going into a bigger community. But it's also a very scary time because you're not confident of yourself and your appearance. So a game that encourages relationships in a very structured way as a onboarding to interaction would be something that would appeal to a teenager in that life phase that they're going through. But I have used my gamification techniques with adults, like the professional people that I mentioned before, and I honestly don't think we're so different to each other at different ages. In Moodle, you have a lot of ticks. If you finish reading something, you get a tick, and they'll constantly be calling me saying, I didn't get all my ticks. I didn't get 100%. And I say, well, to get the certificate, you only had to go to the forum and you only had to do a quiz and you've earned your certificate. I'm like, I still want my ticks. I want 100%. Like, really? So then I realized that I didn't set my Moodle course up correctly. Somebody had issued 2 different certificates in French and English, and the system was thinking that you had to get French and English, so no one could get 100%. I'm like, okay, that's my fault as a designer. Let me go back and I'll take the certificates off the criteria. Both the English and French were removed, and then people could get their 100%. So that's, and I don't know why, but the French participants were much fussier than the English participants about getting all their ticks and 100%. Like 3 times as many support calls came through from the French group. So I don't know why. Actually, there must be something there that makes a difference in what motivates them.
Thank you, Natalie. Alexandra is asking, it is possible to adapt this strategy to a different platform than Moodle?
Yes. All of my talking about Moodle as a learning management system applies equally in Canvas or any other learning management system. So if there's a quiz, I'm talking about the very high level reason of why you would use a quiz. So it's definitely not specific to Moodle.
That's right. Susie Hayes is saying, in my opinion, it's not an easy task to implement this learning journey inside of the design of online courses without getting to know our students and the type of gamer they are, isn't it?
Well, that's true. You walk into a classroom on the first day and you meet people, and then you want to go and change everything because there's more girls or there's more boys or there's more older people. And as teachers, we can't do that. Often our managers want everything done before the term even starts. So I always struggled with this. How do I be adaptable and how do I plan? So that's why I go with these 4 types. Now I can just say, I'm going to expect that my classroom is going to have explorer types. I'm going to expect there to be socializers. And I can plan with an expectation of the types that will come. And then I can also plan knowing that they will change. So they may start with one motivation, and then as they become more confident, their motivation will change. So it does help me predict things that I can't possibly know.
Okay. Karen would like to know, it's saying, I just loved your presentation and I love the way you view gamification. It's
Thank
a
you,
compliment.
Karen.
So I have another question for you, Natalie. I know that fun is an emotion, and certainly when people have fun, they are more open to learning experiences. So how to deal with the family of some students who are resistant to games in their education? Because I say this because for many parents, especially children parents, there is a great expectation of traditional lessons sometimes, as they had when they were a child. So how to convince parents that being fun can also be part of learning?
I still struggle with that myself, honestly. And the more I've got into it, I'm less patient now to explain it. It's frustrating, to be honest, because you keep coming back to this. But some of the arguments I make are when you go to war and you kill somebody or you save somebody, it's not a game. It's not fun. It's not playing. But when you get a stripe on your shirt or you get an Order of Australia medal or a Red Cross, it's your society acknowledging that you have done something for your community that is of the highest, most important value in our society. And that is one of our main gamification tools, is badges and points as feedback. And our society uses it throughout our whole life. It's not something that we only use for children. And the same with sports. Like people get the highest paid people in our society are our football players and our actors and our musicians, and I forget the statistics now, but there's so much of our budget that goes towards entertainment throughout our whole life. There's this fantasy that children are involved in games and plays, and there's a total disregard that adults play. And I don't know why we don't want to acknowledge that. And I did find, I think it was either Spanish or Portuguese, you actually had 2 different words for play. It was the only language on earth that differentiated. And I loved that there's at least one culture that tries to take out this. Because in our heads, we've got the 2, but we don't have a label for it. And I think that's a problem. We should all speak Spanish. Maybe that's the answer.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll also note that I went to Barcelona to a gamification conference many years ago. And I usually go to EdTech conferences, so it was a bit of a shock walking into less geeky people. And it was nice that there were women there. And I was surprised that I hadn't been aware that I was in a male-dominated conference until I wasn't. But there was also something different about being in Barcelona and then I've watched all these presentations. I'm probably really generalizing now, but I would say that some European cultures are more inclined to play and emotion than others. And my father's from Germany, so I'll say this from my own personal background. I think if you as a culture understand play and emotion, you are more ready to embrace gamification. And I think the Spanish world is leading the way in gamification because of your cultural values.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a question?
Mm.
In the middle of the presentation, you talked about involving students in an assessment, right? How did you get students involved in their classmate assessment or even responsible for their own assessment? Because I talk about from my experience, right? It's not very easy. I try to give some instructions, maybe work on some checklists and some guidelines, but they tend to use their own personal impressions instead of having a more, let's say, technical approach to what they are seeing on the behavior of their colleagues, you see, or the classmates. How do you do that?
Well, I'll still say that I was the final call. I was the one who made the final assessment and put it into the grade book. So I didn't step away from it totally. But I did give them checklists, and it was the assignment. So in our college, I think universities are harder because you don't have as many definite deliverables. But for me, it was you have to make a WordPress site, and the WordPress site must have 6 pages, and those 6 pages must have images and text. So it was a very definitive checklist. And I got the people who could do it, because most of the teenagers who walked in my class already had a bunch of skills. So I would ask them who's good at Photoshop, who's good at web design, who's good at programming. And then I would make them the leaders of their guild. And I switched. I always used to be the one that spent time with the learners that were lagging, but I just totally switched. I spent all my time with the leaders. I got them through the material really fast, and then said to them, can you go and show your friends what you did? And here's this checklist, and come back and tell me that you think they're ready to get their master badge like you've got. And the badges made such a difference because I acknowledged them. They said, you actually know how to use Photoshop. Good on you. Here's a badge. You're the Photoshop master. Everybody go and ask them how to use Photoshop and don't ask me. And I said, do you want them digital inside Moodle, or do you want them printed? And they all said, we want them printed. And these are 18-year-old boys. So we printed them and stuck them on the side of their computer. So all of their class knew I'm really good at this thing. And it just worked out for me that everybody was good at something, which is not always the way. I can imagine in different subjects you wouldn't get that holistic approach that I was blessed with in a digital media classroom.
I see. I have other 2 questions related to Moodle. Júnior and I and some other colleagues have worked with Moodle for some time now, teaching usually undergraduate students. It's such a huge platform. It's very nice. We liked it very much. We try to create different activities using what is available there. And when you talked about using Moodle in gamification, I don't know if we could do that properly in the past, right? And my questions are related to that, right? If we use Moodle in gamification, do you need to install any specific plugins, or do you use only the tools available in the regular version?
You can do a lot with just the regular version. Most of what I do is just with the regular version. It's
Really?
how you use the tool.
And
yes, there are plugins, and that poster that I showed you has a list of plugins that I recommend. It is a bit old. There's more available now, but they're not essential.
Oh, nice. I downloaded the poster. It's very nice. The second question about Moodle, when you create the hero's journey in Moodle, do you use different tasks for each student type, or the same task in different levels?
I try to give them a choice. So if you want to prove that you're competent to me by the quiz, you can do it that way. But if you want to prove it by writing me an essay, that's okay. So the trick is not to specify. So you will pass my unit if you do this, and it can be in either way. And you can do both if you want. It's about giving people choices.
Yeah.
And it's also the same tool can be used differently. So the forum discussion, it can be used repeatedly throughout the learning journey, but in very different ways. It's how you configure it. So quite often I'll take the extra step of turning on rating for a forum, which by default only a teacher can rate a forum post. I'm like, wow, here's a great gamification tool. Facebook lives off likes, and here we've got this tool in Moodle and it's off. So I go into permissions and I say that students can rate each other, and then I make that compulsory. I say not only do you have to contribute, but you have to assess what other people have done, and you can't, I lock everything. You can't get to the next section until you have rated somebody else. And they'll say to me, but I can't move on. I was like, that's because one of your friends has to rate what you did. So they'll do, I tend not to use private assignments. I tend to use the forum for all assignments if where possible. So I'll say, you have to go and look at a friend's assignment, and they have to give you a score, and then you can unlock your next activity. So the whole class walks around and does this peer assessment, and then they have the conversation about what they did instead of it being a solo submission for a teacher to mark. It becomes a practice exercise. So one tool can be used in 1,000 ways is my answer.
Yes, your presentation gave me a lot of ideas about using Google and gamification, but I'm still struggling with some things. For example, Moodle is kind of linear, right? In terms of the way, you don't think so? Oh, maybe the way I organize the courses then. That's what I was thinking, right?
So if you go to the bottom, there's always a restriction activity. So I can say you do activity 1, and then you can't do activity 2 until you've done activity 1. But then I can change. I can do branching scenarios after that, and I say you can't do activity 5 until you've done activity 3. And you can put links to send them in different ways. It's very versatile with the restrict access and conditional activities. And that's all just standard Moodle.
Natalie, we need a workshop to learn how to use this Moodle.
I'd be happy to do that.
Yes, I know.
Yes.
It would be very nice. Because as I said, I am still struggling with how to use Moodle in a spiral way, as you said. You see?
Yes.
I think we have time for one more question, right? And I have a question here from Susie. Natalie, how would you be your recommendations to someone that is beginning to apply gamification in the design of a gamified online course, and how to start?
I would say to start with one activity. Don't start with the whole course. So think about what I often say, think about the values that you want. So is it collaboration? If that's a value that you want, how are you going to explain that's your expectation? And you should do it in the first minute. The minute they walk in the room, they should know that this is a collaborative space. How can you use your online space to set that expectation? Then how can you give them feedback on whether they met your expectation? And then how can you give them an incentive or reward? So that's a very small loop of identifying what you want, feedback on it, and then taking them around to the next loop. It's a good place to start.
Thank you very much for your speech, Natalie. It was
It was an honor to be invited. I'm happy to see so many experts and
very inspiring.
Yes, very, very inspiring.
But we do need the course now, huh, Max?
Yeah, so
this is part 2.
We have Natalie contact, so we are going to schedule this this meeting with her.
Yes.
All right. So Simone, you can close, and then thank you very much.
So thank you, Natalie. It's time to end this amazing conference with Natalie. And we would like to thank everyone who participated here this evening with us. And we would like to invite everybody to return tomorrow morning for one more day of Sigatec conference.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And
Bye-bye.
See you tomorrow.
So nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you too, Natalie. Bye-bye. Thank you, Simone, for the help and for everything. Till now.